how World War II would have developed had certain events came out differently than what's written in the history books? In this episode of Board Game Review with Jason, I'm going to show you how you can play around with those possibilities with a series of board games known as Axis and Allies. Welcome to this episode of Board Game Review with Jason. This is a video podcast where we'll explore various board games together. You may find some games you've never heard of, or you may find some you've heard of but not sure if they're worth your purchase. My goal is to take a game, show you how it's played, give you my personal review, and then give you some decision points so you can decide if it's a game you'd like to try out. In this episode we're going to look at a series of games under the Axis and Allies name. All of these games have to do with World War II in one way or the other. First I'm going to give you a short overview of the games in this series, and then take a look at the latest offering to take a more in-depth look at the components and gameplay. All of these games have the same basic flow of play. The basic idea in the majority of these games is that players are going to take on the role of some of the major powers in World War II. The players playing as the Axis powers are going to be pitted against the players playing as the Allied powers. These are not strict historical war games because if they were, there would be no reason to play the game. So each player is going to take their turn as a major power and go through a series of phases. First, you're going to decide how to spend your money in the game. Second, you're going to move your units into combat situations. Third, you're going to resolve those combat situations. Fourth, you're going to move your units into areas where combat would not occur. This is just to move your units around and set up for the next battles and fortify your front lines. Then you're going to place the units you bought at the beginning of your turn, and then you're going to collect your income or your money in the game. And your income is going to vary throughout the game based on the territories that you take over, the ones you control, and the ones you lose. So the original edition was designed by a guy named Larry Harris, and he actually designed all of the Axis and Allies games. The original edition came out in 1981. It was published by a company called Nova Game Designs. But Axis and Allies became really popular in 1984, and Milton Bradley got the series and published what became known as the Classic Edition in 1984. It starts in 1942 and it's a global game, meaning you're playing in countries throughout the world, and it features 5 playable powers. You can play as Germany or Japan for the Axis, or you can play as the United States, the United Kingdom, or the Soviet Union as the Allied. The map board is fairly medium sized for the Axis and Allies games, and it features very vibrant colors. You can see these boxes up here to put units when it gets overcrowded. And the other thing to note is the number of countries between Berlin and Moscow, as that will become important in differentiating these games as we move along. In this game there are only about 3 or 4 territories between Berlin and Moscow. So there is going to be a lot of tension early on between Germany and Russia. The other important thing about this game is it is the one that established the common gameplay mechanics that I went over earlier. These gameplay mechanics will carry forward to the majority of the other games in the series, but they will change a little bit here and there, but for the most part it remains pretty much the same. The classic game also introduced the basic units or miniatures that will be used in the games throughout this series. And these are what I would consider to be the core units in the game, and they actually carry through to the other games in the series, but other games will add new ones into it, and we'll see that as we go along. In the Classic Edition, the victory condition for the Allied players is the same as the historical outcome of World War II, and that is the complete and total surrender of the Axis powers. So in the Classic game, the Allied players have to capture both of the Axis capitals, Germany and Japan. The Axis powers, however, had 2 ways to win. One, they could capture 2 of the 3 Axis capitals, but the other way you could win is through an economic victory. If the Axis powers captures enough territory to achieve a certain level of industrial production, then they achieve a victory. So the classic game became pretty popular and remained pretty popular for the next 14 or 15 years. And then a computer game came out by Hasbro Interactive in 1998 called Axis and Allies, the Ultimate World War II Strategy Game. And this was actually a pretty good way to play the game on your computer when you didn't want to pull out the board game, or if you didn't have other people to play with. You just set it up so that the other powers could be played by the computer. An enhanced version of this computer game came out in the next year, 1999, called Iron Blitz. So the Axis and Allies games weren't only limited to board games, they did have their computer incarnations. Also about this time in 1999 and later in 2001, two new games came out in the Axis and Allies series, but these were theater level games. They weren't played on the global scale. The first one in 1999 was Axis and Allies Europe. The playable powers in Axis and Allies Europe were Germany, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Both of these games start historically around somewhere in 1941. They did add new units into the mix. Axis and Allies Europe added destroyer and artillery units, and then Pacific added marine units. The playable powers in Axis and Allies Pacific were China, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Then in 2004, another computer game version came out, and it was called Axis and Allies RTS. The RTS stood for Real-Time Strategy Game. Whereas the first computer game was more true to the board game and it's a turn-based strategy, this computer game was more real-time. So it became more of an action game rather than a turn-based strategy game. Then in 2004, a more localized game in the Axis and Allies series came out called Axis and Allies D-Day, about the Allied invasion and liberation of France. This game added a blockhouse unit type into the mix. Historically, it starts in 1944 when the actual D-Day invasion happened. The playable powers are Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Then in 2004 came the first big major revision of the base Axis and Allies game. Avalon Hill and Wizards of the Coast got it and published Axis and Allies Revised Edition in 2004. This game took elements from all of the previous incarnations of Axis and Allies and incorporated them into the global game. So this is the second game in the series where you can play on a global scale. You have the same 5 powers as you did in the Classic Edition. You have Germany and Japan as the Axis powers, and then United States, United Kingdom, and Soviet Union as the Allied powers. This celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Axis and Allies series. So it was noticed that in the Classic Edition that what would happen is that players would buy a lot of infantry units, and this was because infantry units were very cheap and they could be just used as cannon fodder. And so you'd see these big build-up of infantry units on the board. So this version tried to address that by increasing the defensive power of tanks so that you could see more attacks and combats involving combined arms. And here we can see the map board for the revised edition, and you'll notice that the colors are much more muted. They're not as vibrant as in the Classic Edition. And the number of territories between Berlin and Moscow have increased, so there's a little bit more wiggle room in there to go back and forth between Germany and Russia. The game starts in 1942, so Germany is very close to Russia, and so in this game you're going to see Russia try to push back Germany immediately. The board is about the same size as the Classic Edition, but you no longer see the little boxes at the top to put extra units when you run out of room on the main game board. The Revised Edition changed the victory conditions and how you win the game. Instead of capturing capitals or an economic victory condition, the paradigm changed to one of victory cities. So you would have a number of victory cities around the board, and once you captured and held on to a certain number of victory cities, you win the game. This also allowed you to play games of varying lengths. So if you wanted a shorter game, you only had to capture a certain number of victory cities. If you wanted a longer game, then you would have to capture more victory cities. These victory conditions will carry forward from this point on with the Axis and Allies games. Then about this time, the Axis and Allies series ventured into yet another area. So you got your board games, you got your computer games, and now you have what's called miniatures. These are collectible miniatures. You can go out and buy your base sets and extension sets, and each one comes with their own rule sets. And a lot of collectors will get these and paint their custom ones. But you can also set up little small tactical battles. So it's more about small battles concentrated more on tactics rather than this large scale game. Also around this time in 2006 and 2007, 2 new games came out in the series and sort of took a departure from the basic gameplay mechanics, and it was sort of their own separate games, but it still had the Axis and Allies name. The first game came out in 2006 and it was called Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge is a local game concentrating on the said battle in 1944. The new unit this game adds is the truck, And the unique idea here is that you're trying to keep your front lines supplied with weapons and ammunition. The playable powers in the Battle of the Bulge are the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany. The second game in these one-off games was published in 2007 called Axis and Allies Guadalcanal. Historically it was in 1942 and it focused on the Solomon Island campaigns in the Pacific. In Axis and Allies Guadalcanal, the cruiser unit type made its debut. The playable powers in Guadalcanal are Japan and the United States. Then in 2008 we returned back to the classic gameplay and the global game. And in 2008, Axis and Allies 50th Anniversary Edition came out. This game celebrated the 50th anniversary of the publisher Avalon Hill Hasbro Wizards of the Coast. The game can start in 1941 or 42. It adds China and Italy to the 5 classic global players. So now you have Germany, Italy, and Japan as the Axis powers, and the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China as the Allied powers. The map board is larger and it features more realistic terrain and more subtle hints of color. The 50th Anniversary Edition was a well-received edition of the game, but the problem is it had a very limited print run. It was probably only available for about 6 months, so only a few people managed to get it, and it's become in high demand. The next game in the Axis and Allies series was published in 2009, and it was called Axis and Allies 1942. And as the name suggests, it starts in 1942. It celebrates the 25th anniversary of the Axis and Allies series. The rules, mechanics, and gameplay are taken from the Anniversary Edition. It is a global game and it returns to the classic 5 playable powers of Germany and Japan versus the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. The map board is about the same as the Classic Edition and the Revised Edition, and like the Anniversary Edition, it features more realistic terrain and subtle hints of color. Axis and Allies 1942 is the current representative game that you can go out and find. It's readily available, and it's the one that's closest to the original Classic and Revised editions in terms of the size of the map board, the number of territories, the 5 classic playable powers. Although it does incorporate the rules and play and mechanics of the Anniversary Edition, it is a very pared down version. It eliminates the research option altogether, so you just have the very basic gameplay here. And now I get to the latest offering of games in the Axis and Allies series, and the one that's going to be the main concentration of this video podcast. In 2009, the Axis and Allies series saw a game known as Axis and Allies Pacific 1940. This is a theater level game. You could look at this as a republishing of the original Axis and Allies Pacific, but it's really much more than that because it adds quite a bit to the Axis and Allies game system, and it's also meant to be combined with the game published next in 2010 called Axis and Allies Europe 1940. So you can put these 2 games together to create a big global game. Or you can play them individually as a Pacific theater level game or just the European theater level game. They both add quite a few new units into the mix. They add the mechanized infantry and tactical bomber units, as well as facilities such as an air base and a naval base. In Pacific 1940, the playable powers are Anzac, China, Japan, the United States, and the United Kingdom. In Europe, the playable powers are France, Germany, Italy, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. When you put these 2 games together and play the massive global game, all of these powers are playable powers. So let's get to this episode's concentration with these 2 games. Let's open these boxes and see what's inside.